I think you've heard some interesting perspective from lawyers and regulators, and now we're going to have an actual session where we look at how things happen. And we're Eric. I see Eric somewhere. There's Eric Schlesinger. Eric Schlesinger is going to moderate this next session, and he's going to bring it up here with Will Turner and Mike Klenna, who are actually doing some things in this space and looking to do more. So let's look at that. Come on up, Eric.
Good afternoon, everyone. What a great day today, right? We're really happy to be following up the SEC's the speech, because this gives us an opportunity to say, okay, now given the regulatory framework that we have in place, what are the challenges and how do we do something with it? So like many new innovations, blockchain technology uses case studies or cases that are still being developed. And moving from theory to commercialization is really, really difficult, especially when the emerging technology and associated services need to fit into these regulatory frameworks. So today we're going to discuss Likho's real-world lessons learned from running a digital asset platform, along with the feedback and help from Barnes and Thornburg's guidance. And we'll focus on three primary issues. Number one will be the commercialization across different jurisdictions. Number two, we'll talk about the emerging digital asset usage. And third, we'll talk about the ICO controversy that we just spoke about a few moments ago. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mike Klenna. Mike is responsible for building and growing Likho's offerings in the Americas. Over the past 25 years, Mike has helped retail trading transition into the digital space. He was a senior executive at several large retail trading firms, at various times overseeing sales, product, service, and operations divisions in the US and globally. Today, Mike is actively involved in the delivery of blockchain products and services and believes it has the same disruptive potential as the internet. Mike's a graduate of the University of Michigan, where he received a degree in economics. And then on the right, we have Will Turner. Will's a partner in the Chicago office of Barnes and Thornburg, and he's a part of their firm's interdisciplinary Fintank practice. His experience includes securities reg, commodities and futures regulation, financial services regulation, information technology, data security and privacy, and contractual issues. And his experience with distributed ledger technology includes representing clients with ICOs and assisting non-US blockchain businesses in evaluating and registering under the applicable US securities and financial regulations. So with that, Mike, why don't you tell us a little bit about Likho's business, the operating exchange, and specifically what makes your company and your platform different from other crypto exchanges?
Okay, thanks, Eric. So I'll start with the grand vision, the utopian vision that Likho has, and then talk about how we translate it into the real world. So with the blockchain, the concept is you could digitize any asset, create a record, digitize it. And if you could digitize anything, the only way to uncover value and price of that is to have an exchange. That's the reason why we have the New York Stock Exchange and all these other things. So our vision is to be able to tokenize anything and then trade it with anyone, anywhere, anytime. Grand vision. And it can be anything, physical, ephemeral things. When you start figuring out how to do that, and that's my job in the US, we have people in Singapore, India, we're a Swiss-based company, so Switzerland, the EU, and the UK, doing the same thing, trying to figure that grand vision into a legal framework so that none of us go to jail. In the US specifically, we have plans to become a broker-dealer, an exchange of the SEC, the same under the CFTC, and for these things that aren't explicitly regulated by those two regulators, then it's a state or potentially a banking regulator that falls in it. So we have to do all of that in order to do the grand vision.
So tell me, as you are looking to move all these digital assets into the US markets, from a business perspective, what are the biggest challenges that you faced so far?
Yeah, I mean, it's been talked about a lot, but I think the regulatory framework and building the infrastructure to handle all that is the hardest. And I think that's also differentiation of Likho. I mean, Likho is filled with people who have deep, deep and long financial service experience. So we're used to playing with these financial regulations, not playing with them, but living with them. Some of our competitors don't. And so our vision has always been, let's go and spend the money and the time and the effort and be fully regulated across all regulatory issues. So whatever the product comes up, we have a regulatory wrapper for it.
Yeah, maybe I would add to this that because of Likho's origins, it has experience in regulatory regimes, so not business regimes, but regulatory regimes that fit a little bit more comfortably into the ICO model. So Mike described, and I appreciate you doing it this way, described his business plans in a manner that accorded with the various regulatory regimes that we have in the U.S., right? But when he started out, he expressed the vision of the company generally, which is to trade all assets digitally all over the world. And that sort of uniform approach is not currently available, as folks have talked about, in the U.S. So you have to think about things on a channeled approach, whereas in some other jurisdictions, that's not necessarily the case, and there is maybe a more uniform approach, including in Switzerland.
That's right. It was brought up earlier about regulatory sandbox. We love it. We play in it a lot. It's particularly in Switzerland, the UK, and Singapore. And the previous speaker from the SEC brought up a good point. Through no action letters, they kind of create a regulatory framework for you to do some of these things. But I think the overriding thing is just don't do it and then ask for forgiveness later. That window of time to do that is shut. So you have to follow the rules.
So Will, as Likho's attorney in bringing the platform here to the U.S., tell me, what are the biggest challenges that you've seen so far, and where do you think you guys are going to be working as you move into bringing other assets to the U.S.?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Just for clarity, Likho is currently not operating in the U.S., so none of its assets are actually available for purchase here.
It's human fine print.
And so one of the interesting things about the Swiss legal regime is that there no action letter system, functions differently, as Mike has alluded to, and their regulator actually seeks to be proactive. And by saying that, I don't mean to be critical of our regulators, which I'll get into in a minute, but seeks to be proactive in terms of providing guidance as to whether or not a particular coin is a security. Now that's possible in Switzerland because their perspective on financial regulation is very different from ours. It comes from a very different set of rules. And so there's not necessarily the need to balance the facts and circumstances, which is required under our laws, and it is, from a company's perspective, very time-consuming and costly. As Mike and I have talked about before, an individual asset analysis for coins is a great business model. It's just not a great business model for Likho. It's a great business model for Barnes & Thornburg. And so part of both responsible business operation and responsible counsel is trying to make choices as to where the company is going to get the biggest value for its regulatory spend. And I'm fortunate as counsel to be able to provide options, and Mike has the burden of selecting among those options in terms of operating his business.
Do you want to add any more to that, Mike?
It is a burden. It's an absolute burden.
So you mentioned, Mike, that your vision is to trade all digital assets all the way across the world in all different formats, right? So what are some of the more interesting assets that you're looking at, as you, roll out, different digital assets?
Yeah, we have several neat things that are on our platform, and because we do have a Swiss platform with about 40,000 clients trading different things, and we're trying to make it easier to make any type of token. Music rights, so if I create a song, I could just post it up in the exchange and people buy it. So cut out iTunes, right? We also, as a firm, have a very strong impact investing belief that we can use capital markets to do better for the world. And we have around 4 or 5 different crypto assets on our exchange that do that, one of which is called the tree coin. In Miramar, there's a reserve to plant mangrove trees. Mangrove trees have the highest carbon capture of any tree. They live on the coastline, they do a lot of great things. You buy one mangrove tree coin, it plants one tree in Miramar. Okay, that's great. But what's neat on that is you get half of that carbon credit for that life of that tree, which is about a 20-year process. You get a dividend for the carbon credit, and you could choose to either keep it or you could give it back to the foundation. I mean, it's a simple thing, but we're getting a significant amount of ideas and people who want to raise money or bring attention to something, but using the exchange forces to do good. And that's an example I love. I mean, it's a neat example.
So before we go on to any other, or the much more controversial ICO topic, do we have any questions out there specifically about the jurisdictional challenges that, that Barnes & Thornburg have been helping Likho with thus far? All right, I guess you guys got all the questions out with the SEC. So Will, tell me a little bit about the controversy on whether ICOs are legal in the US and what your views are and the views of your firm.
Sure, I'll limit it to myself, which is my own views as a firm policy. I mean, Ryan spoke about this a little bit, but I think it bears reiterating just based on the conversations that I've had with folks here at the conference thus far. I mean, the SEC's Dow report, which Ryan alluded to, really is just a statement of longstanding law in the federal securities area. It just happens to make concrete that existing principles apply in the token space. So to some extent, it was not surprising news to securities practitioners. It's still very helpful because it gives, in writing for everybody to see, some guidance as to how the SEC is likely to apply those longstanding principles to their particular facts. And as Ryan has suggested, it's hard for the staff with the constructs it works under to provide more direct guidance than that. So the upshot of that is that coins can in fact be offered in the U.S. It just needs to be done with respect for federal securities laws, state securities laws, and a host of other laws, which sound bewildering when they're recited, but given the amount of activity in the space, there are certain customs that exist within the bar that enable people to get comfortable that certain actions are consistent with best practices in dealing with those issues.
So Mike, what is Likho and the other players in this space doing technologically to, really allow other participants to play in the ICO space?
And I'm going to approach it 2 ways. One is the issuer and one's the investor side. So from the issuer side, the goal is to make it easy. You could just go online, create your own token, and put it out there. Utopian goal. But there are a lot of people who are interested in it. We get about 15 requests a day from issuers, people wanting to do an ICO, have us help them, and list it on our exchange. And we're building a much better process of filtering that out. Because some of them are great ideas, some are just ideas, and some are garbage, and they're fraud, right? And so helping to due diligence that, which is a segue to the investor side, where we try to separate the wheat from the chaff and do the right thing, because we also want to be co-investors along with this. So when we start putting that mindset as, I'm doing my own VC funding here, well, is this a good investment? Then the diligence process is significantly higher. But, and we have the benefit of these jurisdictions that we're working in, because they are regulated or we have a regulatory relief from doing some of these activities. And Singapore was brought up earlier, but Singapore basically will allow a lot of this activity, the non-security ICO activity, to happen under a specific license. And I think that once more firms get their actual license, we'll see a boom in this, because as mentioned on the previous panel, there's been a tampering of at least desire, but there is still a pent-up demand we're finding on both sides.
So before we open it up for final questions, anything else that you guys would like to add specifically around the jurisdictional challenges, the assets that are likely to be traded in the future, and the ICO space?
Sure, I'll put in the regulatory spin. So, having practiced in the securities world for more than 20 years now, I grew up with the mantra that the U.S. Capital markets were a complicated regulatory regime, but necessary, in that the size and sophistication of the market in the U.S. was an indication that the regulatory process was a success. One of the things that's fascinating to me about practicing now in the ICO world is that the current method of issuance is really challenging that presumption, and it remains to be seen whether it enables folks to distinguish between the size of the U.S. investment market, meaning the amount of capital we have, versus the longstanding regulatory disclosure process that we've had.
Yeah, the only thing, hopefully to state the obvious, regulation is necessary. I did some work for a Russian Forex trading firm, and they had about 60 or 70 branches, and then all of a sudden we started losing all this money. All this money was transferring to this other firm. And I asked, what is this other firm, right? And it's a Ponzi scheme. Ponzi's are illegal over there. And maybe they're not now, but back then it was legal. And so people were giving their savings into Ponzi schemes. And then you realize the benefit of regulation. Anytime you have money, you have bad actors who are going to try to take your money. Regulations aren't a perfect barrier, but they're a way to protect people. So with that in mind, ICOs, I think some people had a very libertarian or almost anarchistic view of it. And that's not reality, because people will lose enough money, they'll complain, and then regulatory action will come swifter than we want them to. So the regulatory framework is important, it protects us, and we just live with it.
All right, with that, we'll open it up for the last round of questions.
Absolutely. I mean, that's my reason for living, outside of my family, which I love dearly. But yeah, absolutely. We are trying to build all of these pieces and infrastructure now. So yes, in pieces and products, we'll start be launching some things sooner than later. But the grand vision is within 2 years, hopefully, to have trade anything. Yeah, but we think obviously better. But yeah, it exchange, but exchange for anything.
Go ahead.
So, you have relief for a simpler regulatory regime in Switzerland and Singapore. Does that mean that effectively investors are happy in your space, or is Likho standing in between, kind of as a private regulator that's its due diligence and it has remedies against issuers, that then it's standing to protect investors in the event of fraud or misrepresentation? What recourse is there, if any,
and let me take one shot at this, and then I'll defer to an expert. But by regulatory relief, the regulators is closely engaged in everything that we do. And they're learning also about this space. So they're allowing us to do things with limits. And so I don't know if it's explicit, but it's more of you can do this as long as you allow us to watch you do this and don't go over a certain dollar size or number of clients. And I'm oversimplifying it. And so it gave us and our lawyers, particularly our Swiss lawyers, a high sense of confidence that we're going to do this, just as long as we don't surprise any regulators.
I get that gives Likho protection, that it's not falling about a regulated business. My question is what protection does the investor have
Yeah.
against the issuer that defrauds them or misrepresents? Or is Likho standing in place and ensuring or underwriting those offerings?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I'll think I'll defer to Will on that.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so I think one thing we want to try to distinguish, and maybe we haven't done a very precise job in doing so to date, is what's an issuer, and therefore would have issuer liability under under U.S. laws, as well as laws of other jurisdictions, and what is a platform for the trading of the coins. A discussion of the potential liabilities in this business would be absolutely fascinating to me and cause everybody in this room, other than you perhaps, to walk out, and certainly would cause Mike to ask me to stop at some point. But you should not think that Likho, for that matter, any other entity that is embracing regulation in any jurisdiction is as a malefactor. I would say at present time, entities that are seeking to embrace regulation are folks that have decided as a business matter that being good operators is an appropriate thing to do. In Likho's case, it's more than just a good business matter. It's philosophical. The description of Singapore and Switzerland as being easy or easier is not intended to suggest that they don't have robust sets of laws, because they're actually quite complex. They've just been easier for Likho to move forward more quickly with its business model.
That's right.
So we have time for one more question. Gentleman here.
Will, do you think a pure utility token is never a security? Secondly, do you think a SAP is always?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. My colleague, Lewis Goldman, former colleague Lewis Goldman, who's always been good at framing issues, has asked whether a utility token is never a security and whether a SAFT is always a security. And the answer on a theoretical basis is I don't think you can make either conclusion categorically. Now, people in practice, as Lewis knows, often use utility token to reflect the conclusion of non-security status and use a SAFT because they're choosing to embrace securities regulation for their instrument. But I think the law would dictate that you actually have to do a facts and circumstances analysis, so depending upon the terms of your SAFT or your token, you may or may not reach a conclusion as to security status.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Will and Mike. We appreciate you joining us today.